The Johnson family's old station wagon crept up the long, winding driveway, gravel crunching beneath its tires. The coastal air was thick with salt, and the distant cry of gulls as they circled above the cliffs. The mansion loomed ahead, an imposing structure with weathered stone walls, ivy creeping up its sides, and shattered windows that gave the appearance of vacant, staring eyes. Despite its dilapidated state, the mansion held a certain charm that whispered promises of new beginnings. "We're finally here," Mr. Johnson announced, forcing a cheerfulness he didn't quite feel. His wife, Linda, gave him a supportive smile, though her eyes lingered on the mansion's broken windows with a hint of unease. Their children, Emily and Timmy, bounced in their seats, their initial excitement undimmed by the mansion's eerie appearance. The ocean crashed against the rocks in the distance, its constant roar a reminder of nature's relentless power. Timmy, the youngest at 8, pressed his face against the window. "Look, Dad! The sea! It's so big!" Mr. Johnson nodded. "Yes, Timmy, it is. And it's all ours to explore." He glanced at Emily, who was 13 and less easily impressed. She was staring at the mansion with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They all climbed out of the car, stretching their legs after the long drive. As they approached the front door, a cold wind whipped around them, carrying the faint scent of brine and something else, something old and musty. Linda shivered and pulled her cardigan tighter around her. The heavy oak door creaked loudly as Mr. Johnson pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer that had seen better days. Dust motes danced in the dim light that filtered through the dirty windows, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the high ceiling. A grand staircase curved upwards, its banister polished smooth by time and countless hands. "This place is amazing," Emily said, her voice echoing off the walls. Despite her earlier reservations, the mansion's grandeur was beginning to win her over. Timmy darted past his sister, his sneakers squeaking on the polished wood floors. "Can I pick my room first?" he called over his shoulder, already halfway up the stairs. Linda laughed, the sound light and airy, easing some of the tension. "Go ahead, but don't get lost," she warned playfully. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, his eyes sweeping over the vast foyer. "It's a fixer-upper, but with some work, it'll be magnificent," he said, more to himself than anyone else. As the family began to explore their new home, the mansion seemed to sigh, settling into its new purpose. However, unseen eyes watched their every move, and whispers echoed through the empty halls, unheard by human ears. The Johnsons were not alone in the mansion on the coast. They were merely the latest in a long line of inhabitants, some of whom had never truly left. The first night in the mansion was filled with the bustle of unpacking and the excitement of discovering hidden nooks and forgotten rooms. It wasn't until the house finally fell silent, with the family asleep in their new beds, that the true nature of the mansion began to reveal itself. The wind howled through the gaps in the windows, carrying with it faint, mournful whispers. In the master bedroom, Linda stirred uneasily in her sleep, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and crashing waves. Down the hall, Emily's sleep was disturbed by the sound of soft footsteps just outside her door, though when she woke and listened, there was nothing but silence. Timmy, however, slept soundly, unaware of the figure standing at the foot of his bed, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The mansion, once a beacon of hope and new beginnings, had awoken from its slumber, and with it, the restless spirits of those lost to the sea. The Johnson family had arrived, but their true journey was only just beginning. The sun rose over the ocean, casting a golden glow that softened the mansion's grim exterior. The Johnsons, still basking in the novelty of their new home, gathered for breakfast in the cavernous dining room. Linda had managed to find and clean enough dishes to serve a simple meal, and the family chatted excitedly about their plans for the day. Timmy, full of boundless energy, was the first to finish. "Can I go outside and explore?" he asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Stay close to the house," Mr. Johnson replied, ruffling his son's hair. "And be careful near the cliffs." As Timmy raced out the door, Emily lingered at the table, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you think we'll find any treasure?" she asked, half-jokingly. Mr. Johnson laughed. "Maybe. This place is old enough to have some secrets." Linda smiled but couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The strange dreams from the night before clung to her mind like cobwebs. "Just be careful," she said, repeating her husband's warning. "This house has a lot of history." Outside, Timmy's excitement carried him to the cliffs, where he marveled at the crashing waves below. The salty breeze tugged at his clothes and whispered in his ears, but he paid it no mind, lost in his own adventures. He didn't notice the shadowy figure watching him from the edge of the forest. Inside the mansion, Linda began her exploration, determined to uncover the house's secrets. She started in the attic, where the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Old trunks and crates were piled haphazardly, their contents spilling out in a chaotic array of forgotten relics. As she sifted through the remnants of the past, she found herself drawn to an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Meanwhile, Emily explored the lower levels, her curiosity leading her to a small, neglected library. The shelves were lined with books, many of them ancient and crumbling. As she ran her fingers along the spines, she felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped. She turned, expecting to see an open window, but found nothing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she hurried back to the dining room, her sense of unease growing. Mr. Johnson busied himself with repairs, determined to restore the mansion to its former glory. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, but the hallway was always empty. The sensation of unseen eyes followed him, a constant, oppressive presence. As the day wore on, the family reconvened for lunch. Timmy was breathless with excitement, recounting his adventures near the cliffs. "I thought I saw a pirate," he exclaimed, his eyes wide. "He was watching me from the trees." Mr. Johnson chuckled. "Maybe it was just your imagination, buddy. There haven't been pirates here for a long time." But Linda's face paled, and she exchanged a worried glance with Emily. "Maybe we should stay closer to the house," she suggested, her voice tight. "Just to be safe." That night, as the family settled in for bed, the mansion seemed to come alive with sounds. The wind howled through the gaps in the windows, carrying with it the faint whispers of lost souls. Timmy slept soundly, clutching his stuffed bear, while Emily lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. Linda, unable to sleep, retrieved the journal she had found in the attic and began to read. The entries were filled with accounts of shipwrecks and storms, of lives lost to the merciless sea. One entry, dated over a century ago, caught her eye. It spoke of a curse placed upon the mansion by a group of sailors who had perished in a particularly brutal shipwreck. Their spirits, it said, would forever haunt the land, seeking vengeance on those who dared to live there. A chill ran down her spine as she read the final ominous words. "Beware the whispers in the wind, for they are the voices of the damned." As she closed the journal, a cold breeze blew through the room, extinguishing the candle beside her. In the sudden darkness, she felt a presence, unseen but undeniable. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears with their mournful cries. The mansion was alive, and its restless inhabitants were awakening. The Johnsons had thought they were moving into a new life, but they had unknowingly stepped into a nightmare. The spirits of the sailors, trapped between worlds, were growing restless, and the family was about to face a terror beyond their wildest fears. The first rays of dawn broke through the heavy drapes, casting long shadows across the room. Linda awoke with a start, the eerie whispers from the previous night still echoing in her mind. She glanced at the journal on her nightstand, its pages filled with warnings she could no longer dismiss as mere folklore. Determined to protect her family, she decided to share her findings with her husband. Downstairs, Mr. Johnson was already in the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee. He looked up as Linda entered, her face pale and drawn. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a half-hearted chuckle. Linda's eyes widened. "I think we might have," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She handed him the journal, her fingers trembling. "You need to read this." As Mr. Johnson skimmed through the pages, his expression grew serious. "This is unsettling," he admitted, closing the book with a heavy sigh. "But it doesn't mean it's true. It's just an old story." Before Linda could respond, Emily and Timmy burst into the kitchen, their faces lit with excitement. "Mom, Dad, you have to come see this!" Emily exclaimed, grabbing her father's hand. "Something's happening in the backyard!" The family hurried outside, where they found a strange sight. Hundreds of seashells arranged in intricate patterns across the lawn. The shells glistened in the morning light, their placement too deliberate to be the work of the tide. Timmy pointed excitedly. "Do you think the pirates did this?" Linda knelt to examine the shells, her unease growing. "I don't know, sweetheart, but it's definitely strange." Mr. Johnson forced a smile, trying to ease the tension. "Maybe someone in town is playing a prank on us. Let's not jump to conclusions." But as the day progressed, the strange occurrences became impossible to ignore. Doors slammed shut on their own, furniture shifted positions, and the air grew colder, even as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Timmy's toys would be found in odd places, and Emily's books were often open to pages describing maritime disasters. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, a sudden gust of wind blew through the house, extinguishing the lights. Timmy clung to his mother, his small frame trembling. "I don't like this place, Mom," he whispered. Emily, trying to be brave, suggested, "Maybe we should hold a seance. You know, like in the movies. Maybe the spirits are trying to tell us something." Mr. Johnson hesitated, but Linda nodded, her face set with determination. "It's worth a try. We need to understand what's happening here." They gathered around the dining room table, a single candle flickering in the center. Linda led the seance, her voice steady but filled with apprehension. "If there are spirits here, we mean you no harm. We want to understand why you're haunting this house." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the candle's flame flickered violently. The air filled with the unmistakable scent of salt water and decay. Timmy whimpered, and Mr. Johnson put a reassuring arm around him. A deep, mournful voice filled the room, seeming to come from all directions at once. "Our souls are trapped. The sea took our lives, and this house holds our torment. Leave this place, or join us in eternal sorrow." The family sat frozen in fear, the weight of the spirit's words sinking in. Linda's mind raced, searching for a solution. "How can we help you find peace?" she asked, her voice trembling. The voice grew fainter, as if retreating back into the shadows. "Find the relic. The key to our release lies within the mansion. Only then will our spirits be free. The candle flame extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. The family sat in stunned silence, the enormity of their situation dawning on them. The mansion was more than just a haunted house. It was a prison for tormented souls seeking liberation. Determined to uncover the relic and put the spirits to rest, the Johnsons knew they had no choice but to stay and confront the haunting. Their new home had become a battleground between the living and the dead, and only by solving the mansion's dark mystery could they hope to escape its ghostly grip. Determined to solve the mystery and release the spirits haunting their new home, the Johnson family set to work the next morning. The atmosphere in the mansion was tense, the air thick with a sense of urgency. Linda gathered the family in the living room, the journal clutched in her hands. "We need to find this relic the spirits mentioned," she said, her voice firm. "It has to be somewhere in the mansion." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression resolute. "We'll start with the attic. There are so many old things up there. It's a good place to begin." Emily and Timmy exchanged nervous glances, but followed their parents up the creaking staircase. The attic was dim and dusty, filled with forgotten furniture, trunks, and boxes. The family spread out, carefully sifting through the decades of accumulated belongings. Linda focused on a large, ornate trunk in the corner. It was locked, but the wood had weakened with age. She managed to pry it open, revealing a collection of old letters and photographs. As she sifted through them, she found a letter that caught her eye. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting was clear. "Listen to this," she called to the others, her voice trembling with excitement. She read aloud. "To whomever finds this letter, know that the mansion holds a dark secret. A relic, the key to the spirit's release, is hidden within these walls. Find it, and you will find peace." Mr. Johnson moved to her side, peering over her shoulder. "There's a map here," he said, pointing to a crude drawing at the bottom of the letter. "It looks like it's leading to a hidden room." Emily's eyes widened. "A hidden room? This place just gets creepier." Timmy, ever the adventurer, was already on his feet. "Let's find it." Using the map as a guide, the family traced their way through the mansion. The map led them to the library, where a heavy bookcase lined one wall. Mr. Johnson examined the shelves, running his hands along the spines of the books until he found one that was different, a thick, leather-bound volume that didn't quite fit. He pulled it, and with a loud creak, the bookcase swung open, revealing a narrow passageway. Linda's breath caught in her throat. "I can't believe this was here all along." They entered the passage, the air growing colder with each step. It led to a small, hidden room, its walls lined with shelves containing various artifacts and nautical instruments. In the center of the room was a large, ornate chest. Mr. Johnson knelt before the chest, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among layers of decaying fabric, was a beautiful, intricately carved box. He lifted it out carefully, revealing an old, tarnished key lying inside. "This must be it," he said, holding the key up for the others to see. As soon as the key was exposed, a cold wind swept through the room, and the temperature dropped sharply. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "The key. Release us." Linda took the key, her heart pounding. "We need to find the lock this fits. It has to be somewhere in the house." They returned to the main part of the mansion, the key now their beacon of hope. For the next few hours they searched every room, every nook and cranny, but found nothing. As the day turned to evening, their frustration grew. "Maybe it's outside," Timmy suggested, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Mr. Johnson considered this and nodded. Let's check the grounds. There must be something we've missed. The family ventured outside, the sun setting behind the cliffs, casting long shadows over the estate. They walked the perimeter of the mansion, examining every stone, every crevice. It was Emily who spotted it, a small, weathered door set into the cliffside, partially concealed by overgrown vines. "Over here!" she called, her voice echoing off the rocks. Mr. Johnson approached the door, the key fitting perfectly into the rusty lock. He turned it, and with a groan, the door swung open, revealing a narrow stairway leading down into the darkness. Linda hesitated, her fear palpable. "This must be it," she whispered. "But we have to be careful." Taking a deep breath, the family descended into the unknown, the air growing colder with each step. The stairway led to a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with ancient shipwreck artifacts. In the center of the room stood a large stone pedestal, upon which lay a weathered chest. With trembling hands, Mr. Johnson approached the chest and used the key to unlock it. As the lid creaked open, a blinding light filled the chamber, and the voices of the spirits rose in a deafening crescendo. The Johnsons shielded their eyes as the light grew brighter. When it finally dimmed, they saw the spirits of the sailors, their forms now peaceful and serene. The lead spirit, an old captain with a weathered face, stepped forward. "Thank you," he said, his voice a gentle echo. "You have freed us from our torment. The curse is lifted, and we can finally rest." The family watched in awe as the spirits slowly faded, their forms dissolving into the light. The chamber grew warm, the oppressive cold lifting. As they made their way back to the mansion, a sense of peace settled over them. The house, once filled with restless spirits, now felt calm and welcoming. The Johnsons had not only found their new home, but they had also uncovered and resolved its dark history, freeing the souls trapped within its walls. With the spirits at rest, the Johnson family could finally begin their new life, unburdened by the hauntings of the past. The ghostly mansion on the coast was no longer a place of fear, but a symbol of their strength and resilience. The mansion, now devoid of its spectral inhabitants, felt oddly still. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a tranquility that seemed almost foreign after the previous days of terror. The Johnson family, while relieved, could not shake the feeling that their ordeal was not entirely over. Night had fallen, and the sea was a dark expanse under the moonlight. The family gathered in the living room, each lost in their thoughts. Timmy played with his toys on the rug. Emily was engrossed in a book, and Mr. and Mrs. Johnson shared a quiet moment on the couch, their hands intertwined. "I can't believe it's really over," Linda murmured, her eyes on the flickering fire. "It feels too good to be true." Mr. Johnson squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We did it. We freed them. We can finally make this place our home." A sudden crash from the kitchen shattered the calm. Timmy jumped up, his toys forgotten. "What was that?" Mr. Johnson rose to his feet, his face hardening with resolve. "Stay here. I'll check it out." He moved toward the kitchen, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The house was silent, save for the distant roar of the ocean. As he entered the kitchen, he found the source of the noise. A glass had fallen from the counter and shattered on the floor. He sighed, his tension easing slightly. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, but as he turned to leave, he heard it. A faint, sorrowful moan, like the sound of someone weeping. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the cliffs. Back in the living room, Linda sensed her husband's unease as he returned. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tense. "I heard something," he replied, glancing toward the window. "It sounded like crying." Emily set her book down, her curiosity piqued. "Maybe we should check it out." Despite their exhaustion, the family felt compelled to investigate. They grabbed flashlights and headed outside, the night air cold and biting. The sound of weeping grew louder as they approached the cliffs, mingling with the crash of the waves below. Timmy clung to his mother's hand, his small face set with determination. "We have to help them," he said, his voice small but firm. As they neared the edge, they saw a figure standing at the brink of the cliff. It was a woman, her long hair blowing in the wind, her form translucent in the moonlight. She turned to face them, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Please," she whispered, her voice carried on the wind. "Help me find my child." Linda stepped forward, her heart aching for the spirit. "Who are you?" she asked gently. The woman's form flickered, as if she were struggling to maintain her presence. "I was the wife of a sailor lost to the sea. Our child disappeared the night he died. I've searched for him ever since." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "What can we do?" The spirit pointed toward the beach below. "Find him. Bring him to me. Only then can we both rest." The family exchanged determined glances. They made their way down the narrow path leading to the beach, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The beach was a desolate stretch of sand and rocks, the waves crashing relentlessly against the shore. Timmy was the first to spot something, a small, weathered skeleton, half buried in the sand. He knelt beside it, his heart heavy with sadness. "I found him," he called softly. Mr. Johnson gently lifted the remains, carrying them back up the cliff. The spirit of the woman watched, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, as Mr. Johnson placed the remains at her feet. She knelt beside the skeleton, her form shimmering with emotion. As she cradled the bones, her form began to dissolve into the night. "We can be together now," she whispered, her voice fading. The family watched in awe as the spirit and the remains slowly disappeared, the air around them growing warmer. The sound of weeping ceased, replaced by a sense of peace and closure. As they returned to the mansion, the Johnsons felt a profound sense of relief. The voices from the deep had been silenced, their mournful cries laid to rest. The mansion, once a place of torment, was now a sanctuary for the living and the dead. The Johnson family knew that their journey was far from over. The mansion still held many secrets, and the sea would always be a reminder of the spirits they had encountered. But they faced the future with renewed hope and strength, ready to embrace their new life on the coast. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the storm clouds of the past seeming like a distant memory. Yet the Johnson family couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover about their new home. Determined to get some answers, they decided to visit the town's elderly lighthouse keeper, who was known to be a local historian. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory, its weather-beaten walls a testament to countless storms. The keeper, Mr. McAllister, was a grizzled man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He welcomed the Johnsons into his small cottage adjacent to the lighthouse, offering them tea and biscuits. "What brings you folks out to my neck of the woods?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of salt air. Mr. Johnson explained their situation, detailing the strange occurrences and the spirits they had encountered. Mr. McAllister listened intently, nodding occasionally but remaining silent until Mr. Johnson had finished. "You've moved into the old Winslow mansion, haven't you?" he finally said, a shadow crossing his face. Linda nodded. "Yes, we have. Do you know anything about it?" Mr. McAllister sighed deeply. Aye, I do. That place has a dark history, one that goes back centuries. It all started with the shipwrecks. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as he began to recount the tale. The waters off that coast are treacherous, full of hidden reefs and powerful currents. Many ships have met their end there, and many sailors have lost their lives. The Winslow family who built the mansion were known to lure ships to their doom with false lights, hoping to salvage the cargo. Emily gasped. That's horrible. Aye, it is, Mr. McAllister agreed. The spirits of those sailors never found peace, and they've haunted that mansion ever since. But there's more to the story. One of the sailors was a young man named Daniel, who fell in love with Elizabeth Winslow, the daughter of the house. When he found out what her family was doing, he tried to stop them. They killed him for it, and Elizabeth, heartbroken, took her own life. Their spirits are said to be the most restless of all. The Johnsons sat in stunned silence, absorbing the gravity of Mr. McAllister's words. Timmy was the first to speak. Can we help them too? Mr. McAllister nodded. Perhaps. Elizabeth's spirit is said to linger in the old lighthouse, waiting for her love to return. If you can reunite them, it might bring them both peace. Determined to help, the family followed Mr. McAllister to the lighthouse. The spiral staircase was steep and narrow, leading up to the lantern room. The air grew colder as they ascended, and the sense of being watched intensified. In the lantern room, a faint figure stood by the window, her form translucent in the daylight. She turned as they entered, her eyes filled with sorrow. Who are you? She asked, her voice a mere whisper. We're here to help, Linda said gently. Are you Elizabeth? The spirit nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I've waited so long for Daniel. He promised he would return, but he never did. Mr. McAllister stepped forward, his expression softening. Elizabeth, Daniel was murdered by your family. His spirit has been searching for you ever since. Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock and grief. No, it can't be true. Linda took a deep breath. We can help you find him. His spirit is restless, just like yours. But we need to know where he might be. Elizabeth pointed toward the sea. He always loved the ocean. He would go there to think, to find peace. The family exchanged glances, understanding the unspoken words. They thanked Mr. McAllister and made their way back to the mansion, determined to find Daniel's spirit and reunite him with Elizabeth. That evening they walked along the cliff edge, calling out to Daniel. The wind carried their voices, mingling with the sound of the waves. As the moon rose, casting a silvery glow over the water, a figure appeared on the rocks below. It was Daniel, his form as ethereal as Elizabeth's. He looked up at them, his eyes filled with longing. Elizabeth, he called, his voice carrying over the waves. Linda stepped forward, her heart pounding. She's waiting for you at the lighthouse. Come with us. Daniel's form wavered as if he were struggling to remain solid. I can't. I'm bound to the sea. Emily, her voice firm and determined, called out. You can do it, Daniel, for Elizabeth. She needs you. The spirit seemed to draw strength from her words. Slowly, he began to move toward them, his form growing more solid with each step. The family guided him up the path to the lighthouse where Elizabeth waited, her form glowing with hope. When Daniel reached the top, he and Elizabeth embraced, their forms merging into a single radiant light. The lighthouse, dark for so long, suddenly blazed to life, its beam cutting through the night. Thank you, Elizabeth's voice echoed, filled with joy. We are finally at peace. The light gradually dimmed, and the spirits of Daniel and Elizabeth faded into the night, their long vigil over at last. The Johnson family stood in silence, awed by what they had witnessed. As they made their way back to the mansion, the weight of the past lifted from their shoulders. The voices from the deep had been silenced, and the spirits that had haunted their home were finally at rest. The Johnsons knew there might still be secrets hidden within the mansion's walls, but for now they could enjoy the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. The ghostly mansion on the coast was no longer a place of fear, but a testament to their courage and determination to uncover the truth and bring light to the darkness. The peace that had settled over the mansion was short-lived. Though the spirits of Daniel and Elizabeth had found rest, the Johnsons began to realize that not all the spirits were appeased. There was a darker force at play, one that still held sway over their new home. It started with small disturbances, muffled voices at odd hours, cold spots in the middle of the warmest rooms, and shadows that moved independently of any light source. Linda, unable to sleep, would wander the house at night, feeling an oppressive presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. One evening, as the family sat in the living room trying to relax, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Timmy clung to his mother, his small frame trembling. "Mom, I'm scared," he whispered. Mr. Johnson fumbled for a flashlight, his face tense. "Stay together," he instructed, his voice steady but filled with underlying worry. "I'll check the fuse box." Linda hugged Timmy tightly, her own fear mounting. "Be careful," she called after her husband as he made his way to the basement. Emily, trying to be brave, sat close to her mother, her eyes wide in the dim light. "Mom, what if there's something else here? Something we haven't seen yet?" Linda took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "We'll figure it out, Emily. We have to." In the basement, Mr. Johnson found the fuse box and flipped the switches, but the power didn't return. Instead, he was met with a chilling sight, an old crumbling door that he hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. His curiosity piqued. He pushed the boxes aside and pulled the door open, revealing a narrow passage leading deeper into the earth. He hesitated, then called up to Linda. "I found something. Bring the flashlight." Linda and the children hurried down, their fear mingling with curiosity. Mr. Johnson led the way, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The passage was damp and cold, the air growing more stifling as they descended. At the end of the passage, they found a small underground chamber. The walls were lined with strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood an ancient stone altar. The oppressive feeling that had been haunting them seemed to emanate from this place. Linda shivered, her eyes fixed on the altar. "What is this place?" Mr. Johnson moved closer, examining the symbols. "It looks like some kind of ritual site. But who would have built this? And why?" Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "Maybe this is where the curse started. Maybe this is why the spirits can't rest." Timmy, sensing the danger, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Can we leave? I don't like it here." Linda nodded, taking Timmy's hand. "We should go. We need to find out more about this place before we do anything." The family retreated to the mansion, the discovery of the underground chamber weighing heavily on their minds. That night, Linda couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, the symbols from the chamber etched in her mind. Determined to uncover the truth, she rose and went to the library, searching through the old books they had found when they first arrived. Hours passed as she pored over the texts, her eyes growing heavy. Just as she was about to give up, she found a dusty tome tucked away on a high shelf. It was a history of the Winslow family, detailing their rise to power, and their eventual downfall. As she read, a chilling picture began to emerge. The Winslows had dabbled in dark rituals, using the underground chamber to invoke ancient malevolent spirits. They believed these rituals would grant them power and protection, but instead, they had cursed their land and their descendants. Linda's hands shook as she turned the pages. The final entry was a warning, written by the last surviving member of the Winslow family. The darkness we have summoned cannot be contained. It seeks to consume all who dwell here. Only by destroying the altar and breaking the seals can the curse be lifted. She ran to wake her husband, her mind racing. "I found it," she said, her voice urgent. "I know how to stop this." Mr. Johnson listened as Linda explained, his face growing pale. "We need to destroy that altar," he said grimly. "But it won't be easy." The next morning, the family prepared for their task. Armed with tools and determination, they made their way back to the underground chamber. The oppressive air seemed thicker, the darkness more consuming. As Mr. Johnson raised the sledgehammer, a deep, guttural voice echoed through the chamber, shaking the very ground. "You cannot destroy what has been bound," it growled. "You will join us in eternal darkness." Ignoring the voice, Mr. Johnson brought the sledgehammer down with all his might. The stone altar cracked, and a blinding light filled the chamber. The symbols on the walls began to glow, then fade, as if the power within them was being drained. The oppressive presence grew weaker, the air becoming lighter. With each strike, the altar crumbled further, until it was nothing but rubble. The ground beneath them trembled, and the chamber began to collapse. "Run!" Mr. Johnson shouted, grabbing Timmy and leading the way back up the passage. The family emerged from the basement, covered in dust but triumphant. The mansion, once dark and foreboding, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The curse had been lifted, the dark force banished. As they stood together, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, the Johnsons knew that their battle was finally over. The mansion was truly theirs now, free from the shadows of the past. The sinister revelation of the Winslow family's dark deeds had been uncovered, and with it, the spirits that had plagued them were finally at peace. The Johnson family could now look forward to a future filled with light and hope. The ghostly mansion on the coast transformed into a place of new beginnings. Despite their victory over the dark force that had haunted the mansion, the Johnson family's sense of peace was short-lived. The destruction of the altar had lifted the curse, but something lingered. Something insidious that began to take its toll on the family's psyche. It started with small changes. Mr. Johnson found himself unable to concentrate on his work, his thoughts scattered and restless. Linda's sleep was plagued by nightmares filled with shadowy figures and endless corridors. Emily withdrew into herself, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a quiet, unnerving intensity. Timmy, once full of boundless energy, became sullen and fearful, often waking in the night screaming about monsters in his room. The oppressive atmosphere of the mansion seemed to seep into their very souls, and the family began to turn on each other. Arguments erupted over the smallest things, their tempers flaring with a suddenness that left them bewildered and ashamed. The mansion, once a symbol of their resilience, had become a prison of their own making. Linda, desperate to understand what was happening, returned to the library. She spent hours poring over the old books and journals, searching for any clue that might explain their descent into madness. One night, as she sifted through a pile of ancient tomes, she found a hidden compartment in the floor. Inside was a weathered leather-bound book, its pages filled with handwritten notes and cryptic symbols. As she read, a chilling realization dawned on her. The book was a journal written by the last surviving member of the Winslow family. It detailed the final days of the mansion's original inhabitants, their slow spiral into insanity, driven by the very darkness they had unleashed. The curse was only part of it, Linda whispered to herself, her hands shaking. The true evil is the house itself. It feeds on fear and despair, driving its inhabitants to madness. Armed with this new knowledge, Linda confronted her family. "We have to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "The house is still affecting us. It's driving us mad, just like it did to the Winslows." Mr. Johnson, his face gaunt and eyes haunted, nodded slowly. "I felt it too. We need to get out of here." But as they began to pack, the house seemed to fight back. The walls groaned, the temperature plummeted, and the shadows deepened. Timmy clung to his mother, his eyes wide with terror. "The monsters don't want us to leave," he whispered. Emily, her face pale and drawn, shook her head. "No, we can't leave. We have to stay. We have to understand." Linda grabbed her daughter's shoulders, her grip firm. "No, Emily, we have to go. This place isn't safe." The family's resolve wavered as the house's malevolent influence tightened its grip. Linda's nightmares grew worse, filled with visions of her family lost in endless darkness. Mr. Johnson's paranoia deepened, convinced that unseen eyes were watching their every move. Emily began to hear voices, whispering secrets that only she could understand. Timmy's night terrors became more frequent, his screams echoing through the halls. One night, as the storm raged outside, the tension reached a breaking point. Linda, driven to the edge by her nightmares, wandered the halls in a daze. She found herself in the attic, the place where they had first discovered the journal. As she stood there, the wind howling through the broken windows, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she saw a figure, a shadowy, indistinct form that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The figure reached out, its hands stretching impossibly long, and Linda screamed, stumbling back. She fled down the stairs, her heart pounding, and burst into the living room where the rest of the family had gathered. "They're here!" she cried, her voice frantic. "The spirits, the darkness, it's all still here." Mr. Johnson grabbed a flashlight, his face set with determination. "We need to stick together. We need to find a way out." But as they moved through the house, the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing, blocking their path. The walls closed in, the air grew thick and stifling, and the whispers grew louder, filling their ears with maddening, incomprehensible words. In their final moments of desperation, the family made their way to the front door, only to find it sealed shut. The house, it seemed, would not let them go so easily. Linda, her mind teetering on the edge of madness, remembered the journal's warning. The true evil is the house itself. It feeds on fear and despair. "We have to destroy it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to burn it down." Mr. Johnson hesitated, but seeing the fear in his family's eyes, he nodded. "Gather everything flammable. We'll do it together." The family worked quickly, piling furniture, books, and anything else that would burn in the center of the living room. As Mr. Johnson struck a match, the fire roared to life, consuming the room with a ferocious intensity. The flames spread rapidly, the heat driving them back. They watched as the fire devoured the mansion, the walls cracking and the roof collapsing. The malevolent presence screamed in fury, a sound that echoed through the night. As the fire consumed the mansion, the oppressive weight lifted from their minds. The darkness that had plagued them dissipated, leaving behind a sense of relief and freedom. Standing together, watching the flames, the Johnson family knew that their ordeal was finally over. The ghostly mansion on the coast was no more, its dark legacy reduced to ashes. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, ready to rebuild their lives and leave the past behind. As the inferno raged, casting eerie shadows against the night sky, the Johnson family stood at the edge of the cliff, the heat from the burning mansion at their backs. They watched in a mix of horror and relief as the house was consumed by flames. The oppressive darkness that had clung to them was lifting, but their ordeal was far from over. The fire illuminated the rocky coastline, revealing a treacherous path leading down to the sea. The family knew they couldn't stay here. The fire would attract attention, and they needed to get to safety before anyone arrived. Mr. Johnson turned to his family, his face lit by the glow of the flames. "We need to get to the town," he said. "We'll be safe there." With the mansion collapsing behind them, the family began their descent. The path was steep and uneven, and the sea roared below, crashing against the rocks. Linda held tightly to Timmy's hand, her heart pounding with each precarious step. Emily, her face set with determination, followed close behind. As they reached the base of the cliff, a dense fog began to roll in from the sea, shrouding the path ahead. The sound of the waves grew louder, almost deafening, as if the ocean itself was angry. Mr. Johnson led the way, using the flashlight to pierce the thick mist. The fog grew thicker, and soon they could barely see a few feet in front of them. The path seemed to stretch endlessly, and a sense of dread settled over them. Timmy clung to his mother, his small frame shaking with fear. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" he whispered. Linda squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be fine. Just keep moving." The fog swirled around them, and the path became more difficult to navigate. Rocks and debris littered the way, and the sound of the crashing waves seemed to come from all directions. Mr. Johnson paused, trying to get his bearings. "We need to keep heading west," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. As they moved forward, the fog seemed to part slightly, revealing a figure standing on the path ahead. It was the ghostly form of the old lighthouse keeper, Mr. McAllister, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You're almost there," he said, his voice echoing eerily. "Keep going, and you'll find your way." The family hurried past the apparition, their fear driving them forward. The fog began to lift, and the path became clearer. They could see the lights of the town in the distance, a beacon of hope cutting through the darkness. But as they neared the town, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The air grew colder, and a low, rumbling sound filled the air. The family stopped, their hearts pounding with fear. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Before Mr. Johnson could answer, the ground split open, and a chasm appeared in front of them. From the depths of the earth, a dark, shadowy figure emerged, its form shifting and writhing as if made of smoke and darkness. The malevolent presence from the mansion had not been entirely destroyed. It had followed them, seeking to claim their souls. "You cannot escape," the figure hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. "You belong to me." The family backed away, their fear palpable. Mr. Johnson, his face set with determination, stepped forward. "We defeated you once. We can do it again." The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "You are weak. You cannot destroy me." Linda, feeling a surge of anger and defiance, stepped forward. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice strong. "We will not let you take us." The figure's form shifted, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. "Then you will perish." As the dark presence advanced, Mr. Johnson turned to his family. "Run to the town. I'll hold it off. No! Linda cried, grabbing his arm. We do this together! Emily and Timmy stood by their parents, their faces filled with determination. We're a family, Emily said. We face this together. The dark figure lunged, its shadowy form reaching out to engulf them. The family stood their ground, united in their resolve. As the darkness closed in, Mr. Johnson raised the flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadow. Go back to the darkness, he shouted, his voice filled with defiance. The figure recoiled, its form dissipating slightly in the light. Linda and Emily joined in, their voices rising in unison. You have no power over us! The dark presence shrieked, its form breaking apart under the combined force of their will. The ground beneath them trembled, and the chasm began to close. The figure's screams echoed into the night as it was pulled back into the depths of the earth. The fog lifted, and the night grew still. The path to the town was clear, and the lights of safety beckoned them forward. The family, exhausted but victorious, made their way to the town, the weight of their ordeal lifting with each step. As they reached the outskirts of the town, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land. The Johnson family, united by their struggle and their victory, knew that they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. They found refuge in the town, welcomed by the locals who had heard the legends of the ghostly mansion. The Johnsons knew that their lives would never be the same, but they also knew that they had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The ghostly mansion on the coast was now a memory, a testament to their courage and resilience. They had escaped the darkness, and with it, they had found a new beginning. The past would not haunt them any longer, and the future was filled with hope and light.